Facebook. And then you can only cross-post your live from here. Facebook is saying weird things to me that I don't understand. It's fine, it's fine. Why, Facebook? Always saying weird things, I don't understand. Anywho, look at that, we're live. And as you can see, I'm in my new space. And as you can likely hear, it's still pretty empty. So that big old echo that you're hearing will go away, I'm sure, once I have more than just a desk and like a sideboard. And a chair. I have a chair too, you can kind of see that. Wait. Oh. So yeah, once I have more than a few things in here, I'm sure that the echo will go away, and if it doesn't, then we'll see. It's all a work in progress. I'm just happy to be in here, you know what I'm saying? Just happy to be in this space. Finally, I have my own space. What? That's crazy. That's intense. All right, so we are at 12:01 my time, so let's get to it, shall we? Oh, see, that's very echoey. Very echoey. Anyway, let's get to it. Hopefully the sound is okay, even though it is quite echoey. Anyway, like I said, hopefully by next week, we'll have a few more things up. So then there'll be, I do have a carpet in here, but it's still pretty echoey, obviously. Okay, let's get to it. My name is Dr. Shannon Cooks. I am someone who talks about neurodiversity in the voice studio a lot, but that's mostly because that's what's coming up. So I also provide resources for voice teachers for lots of other things. Things like Anatomy and Physiology 101. So the Vocal Instrument 101 is an online course that you can do in the privacy of your own home. Modules avec moi. As well as, in fact, the Vocal Instrument 101 is live last weekend of April, so put that in your calendar if it's something you've been thinking about doing. So that's like anatomy and physiology of the voice, and then how do we apply? I'm doing a practicum on that as well, so I'll do some in the studio live training, but that's later. So right now, what I'm doing is the Spring Break Intensive. Who comes up with these names? Anyway, the Spring Break Intensive, which is the first week of April, and that is 5 classes, 90 minutes each. We're talking about ADHD in the voice studio. We're talking about neurodiversity in the voice studio. We have an actually autistic voice teacher coming in. There's myself delivering some classes, as well as a neurodiversity affirming therapist. So some classes, as well as a couple of panel discussions, all about neurodiversity in the voice studio. And so today I am coming to you live. Let me just make this clear as well. Today I'm coming to you live from the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga and Wendat-Uinio and Sio peoples. And those, I was just reading, so hoping to make sure that land acknowledgements don't become like super performative, which is very easy for them to become. But anyway, this book by Asha Frost, who is an Indigenous woman. Oh, yay! Erin, woohoo! Yes, exactly. So I am doing, I just received Asha Frost's book in the mail, and so I've just started to read it. And Asha Frost is an Indigenous medicine woman here from, and she's just around the corner from me, actually, in a town nearby. So I thought that I would just read this a little bit here. It's a wonderful introduction so far. I'm only in the introduction, haven't got past the introduction yet. I just started reading it, but and I just thought this is such a beautiful way to think about land acknowledgement. So as you begin this book, take a moment to acknowledge the traditional lands you are on. If you don't know, etc., etc. As you acknowledge the earth beneath your feet, feel the spirit of the land and all it carries, for it has witnessed lifetimes of both beauty and pain. Land acknowledgements remind everyone of the truth that we, Indigenous people, are still here. When spoken with intention, the words remind all who listen that no one can erase our colonial and oppressive history, As Indigenous people, we place ourselves in relationship to the land. We don't own it. We have a kinship with it. When we speak these words, we acknowledge the broken treaties and the repair that is needed. Land acknowledgements are so much more than words spoken. They create ripples of healing past, present, and future. So I wanted to just kind of put that in the mix along with the actual land acknowledgement. And if you are so inclined, her book is available on wherever you buy books. So that is something to consider. You Are the Medicine is what it's called. 13 Moons of Indigenous Wisdom, Ancestral Connection, and Animal Spirit Guidance. So that's something to consider. All right. So why, as I said earlier, I'm talking a lot in the last little while, especially I've been talking a lot about neurodiversity in the voice studio and understanding neurodivergent singers and working with neurodivergent singers. And so I wanted to say just today in my live office hours, and of course that's been all over my social media, of course, because as I'm moving into the course, I want to make sure people know about it. But also, I have talked in and out about neurodiversity in the voice studio throughout my live office hours. If you've followed me at all, you will know that I definitely have a little bit of a swing toward education in that realm. So I wanted to just say a little bit about why is it so important? I mean, obviously it's important to me. I have a little bit of a vested interest. I support neurodivergent children, teenagers, adults, actually, late teens. So there's a little bit of that invested interest. I also, I am a self-diagnosed ADHD person, so there's a little bit of that as well. So there's that, but it's more than that. It's not just because of my personal connection to neurodiversity. I think, so I wanted to just make that clear today a little bit in what will probably be a somewhat shorter live office hours today. So I wanted to just make that clear. So why neurodiversity in the voice studio? One of the main reasons I think is that when we start to understand neurodiversity and we start to understand how brains work, and as Alison Davies says, who is a wonderful autistic educator and music therapist from Australia, and if you haven't seen her work yet, that is someone to look up, certainly. I'll put a link to her stuff as well, or tag her stuff as well. But as she says, brains equal behavior. So much of the behavior that we tend to, that society and schools, etc., tend to either impose this negative characteristic to, tends to, can actually, if we understand neurodiversity, we start to see that behavior in a different light. And if we can start to support neurodiversity and support neurodivergent individuals in our voice studio and singers in our voice studio, we start to be able to support and then see that behavior as a reflection of something that needs to be changed in the environment, or something that needs to be changed in the way we teach, or something that we can change in the way we support students. So that becomes a way to support students the more we understand how brains work and how neurodiversity can affect behavior. So that also then, and we're going to dig into this a little bit more in Building Inclusive Voice Studios, which is the class that I'm doing on the Wednesday of the Spring Break Intensive. We're going to dig into this a little bit more, but when we start to look through a neurodiversity lens, when we start to see and support and put things in place that support neurodivergent folks, we then also support so many other kids, like so many other folks. So because of all the intersections, right? So when we support neurodivergent folks, what that means is we support girls. Girls are let's take autism, for example, autism and ADHD, for example. Both of those diagnoses were made by white men, and they were descriptions of what white boys do. So all of the things that we looked for in ADHD and in autism, and all of the diagnostic tools and all of the traits that we considered typical for ADHD and autism were the traits that are typical to white boys. I'm not making this up. I mean, I can throw some stuff in the comments as well about that, but all of those things that we attribute, all of the things that we think of as being typical traits for ADHD or for autism, that's the way that ADHD or autism shows up typically in boys. So when we start to understand how neurodiversity works and how that affects brains, we start to then support neurodiversity and neurodivergent students. We're then affirming and supporting girls. So that becomes an affirming part of affirming girls, which means that when we see a girl, a female, someone who we perceive as female or someone who we perceive as a girl, and we see that they're perhaps not reading as well, or perhaps they don't seem to be paying attention by looking directly at you, then rather than thinking, this kid, they're just not that smart, or they're not working hard enough, or blah, 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 we may actually realize and give the support and affirmation to that girl, and you may be the only, young female, you may be the only, you may be one of the few spaces in their lives where they feel supported and where they don't feel like they're being judged for being lazy, for example, or where they don't feel like they're being judged as a procrastinator, because you've already put the things in place in your studio that will mean that they can be successful, even if they are working with an ADHD brain, or even if they're working with an autism brain, right? Like even if they're autistic, those things are already in place. So then we have young females, or folks who are perceived as female, or who are female, we have those folks in the voice studio being supported in a way that they may not be being supported in other places in their lives, because we understand neurodiversity shows up differently in this population than it does in this population. We understand what it looks like in girls versus all of the things that we've thought of that it looks like in boys. So that's one thing. We support our females better. We support LGBTQ plus folks better. So there's a higher percentage of LGBTQ plus and gender non-conforming folks in the autistic population in particular versus in the neurotypical population. So there's a higher percentage of folks in the autistic population who identify as either gender non-conforming or LGBTQ plus. So, and/or. There's all sorts of and/ors there, right? So what happens when we support neurodivergent folks in the voice studio, or when we start to have inclusive policies in the voice studio that support neurodivergent folks? Well, then we start to also have an inclusive voice studio for folks who are, who may need gender affirmation, who may be gender nonconforming, or who may be LGBTQ+. So we start to support those folks as well. When we have inclusive voice studios of neurodiversity through a neurodivergent lens, we also start to support BIPOC folks. So we start to support people of color because all of these diagnoses around ADHD and autism were all based on white boys. So even to this day, neurodivergent senses, for example autism, or for example ADHD, are very underdiagnosed in folks of people of color. So that when we open our studios through that neurodivergent lens and we start to say, hey, in this space, so if we're looking at a white child and a black child, for example, a doctor will be more inclined, if they have exactly the same traits and they're showing exactly the same behaviors, a doctor will be more inclined to give the medical profession will be more inclined to give a diagnosis of autism or ADHD to the white child versus giving a diagnosis to the black child. So the black child is far more likely to get a behavioral issue diagnosis, right? That they're far more likely to be told that they, that they have behavioral issues. They're defiant. They need better homes. They haven't blah blah blah. So all of the things that we might see exactly the same traits in two children, that diagnosis is far more likely to be missing in a child of color than in a white child. So when we open our studios, and our studio is neurodivergent inclusive, when we start to support neurodiversity and we start to be affirming and have some of these inclusive policies in place, then folks of color who may have thought, I mean, it's similar to what I said earlier, but folks of color who may have thought that they were just, may have been told, that they were just, not well behaved, or, not disrespectful or defiant, or never listened, or never sit still, all of those things. Those folks, when we have things in place where where those behaviors aren't necessary because we're supporting neurodivergent folks in our studios, then those folks, whether they have a diagnosis or not, and likely not, are going to feel like they're good kids. They're going to feel like they belong. They're going to feel like they're not being judged by the authority. They're going to feel like they have a space. So we support people of color when we start to look through a neurodivergent lens. When we start to look through a neurodivergent lens, we also support underprivileged folks. So again, this thing about having a diagnosis and recognizing who needs a diagnosis. In Canada, I'm saying Canadian, in Canada, you can get a diagnosis through the school at a low for free. It's covered by our education system, and it's covered by our socialized health care. So you can get that done, but it's like 3, 4, 5, 6 year wait, and it's kind of a rushed process, and it's not as possibly not as comprehensive as it might be, and whereas you can also then pay for a private a diagnosis for psychoeducational assessment is what the full diagnosis is called here, the full whatever it's called here, the assessment is called. And so you can pay for that, but that is thousands of dollars. And so unless you have excellent insurance, you might wish to wait for to get that through the school system, which means that, again, whether someone has a diagnosis or not, and of course it's sort of like middle and upper middle class who are far more likely, and white folks and middle and upper middle class white boys who are far more likely to have a diagnosis. And so when we have that diagnosis in place, then parents, educators, etc. are more willing to say, oh, here's how we can support you. Whereas if we are working from that understanding in the voice studio, if we're working from that understanding of neurodiversity and neurodivergent singers in the voice studio already, it doesn't matter whether you have a diagnosis or not. So then the folks who are far less likely to have a diagnosis and to be able to ask for what they need because they know that they need the thing, rather than thinking that they're just not smart, or they're just, they bad behavior, or they're just lazy, or they're just all of those things, then the things that we do in the voice studio then support those students whether they have a diagnosis or not. So we support those students as well. We also support, there is a higher instance of chronic illness within the autistic community, especially than in the general population. There are some chronic illnesses that seem to kind of come along with autism, especially. So again, same thing. When we support neurodivergent folks in the voice studio, and when we have those things in place already, who are we then also supporting? We are supporting folks who are chronically ill, whether they are autistic or not. We are supporting chronically ill folks, because those folks, the things that are going to be in place in our lesson, in our attendance policy, in our makeup policy, all of the things that we put in place to make sure that folks come every single week. Those things are really great for folks who are able-bodied and who have no mental health issues and who have no chronic illness. But if we have policies in place with an idea toward allowing and normalizing taking a day off, or for mental health, or taking a day off when you just can't fight that chronic illness, or taking the time, or having something in place when for folks to access the studio more easily, we also then support folks with mental health challenges, we support folks with chronic illnesses, and we support disabled folks. So that becomes this when we look through a lens of neurodiversity, now I'm not saying that this is the only lens to look through, obviously. However, I am saying that when we start to look through this lens at inclusivity through this lens of neurodiversity, and we start to set up our voice studios and understand how people work through this lens of neurodiversity, we also then support so many other folks as well. Trauma-informed teaching also works very well through the lens of neurodiversity. This inclusivity lens. There's always going to be lots of. What's that called? There's a word. Anyway, so we support all of our students. That's why, obviously, that's one of the reasons that I think it's really important that we talk about neurodiversity in the voice studio. Or one of the reasons I do what I do. And then the third reason, the first reason is just like personal, right? I've got this personal stake in this. Want to make the world a better place for my kids, right? So there's that. And then the second reason is that we support all of our students better, and we affirm all of our students better when we are creating inclusive voice studios for neurodivergent folks. And then the third thing is something that has come up, I would say, basically every single time I have done a class or given a workshop or done a guest speaking on neurodiversity and on working with neurodivergent students. I would say this comes up every single time, and sometimes multiple folks email me who say, this information explains so much about myself. And so as a voice teacher and my whole life, and oh my gosh, what is happening? This information is changing. I understand my life in a very different way right now. So that has been primarily from undiagnosed folks or self-diagnosed folks and adults who, upon hearing the information around working with neurodivergent singers in the voice studio recognize so many of the traits and some of the things in themselves, and then that becomes like, okay, this whole other exploration around my self-perception and around how I work and all of the stories that I've told myself. I've said this before. A couple of weeks back, I talked about ADHD for myself and sort of my kind of like coming to an understanding with that. And so that's the third reason I think it's really important that we talk about neurodiversity in the voice studio, is that I think there are just a lot of us out there teaching and feeling like we're lazy people, or feeling like we're procrastinators, or feeling like we never seem to get anything done, or feeling like we always have these really awkward social interactions, or feeling like we can never really understand what the parents are talking to me about, or feeling like I can never really reach a student, or, I mean, there's so many different things that once we kind of understand, oh, wait a minute, then we can have the grace for ourselves, and we can start to kind of lean into and understand, oh, those things that I was doing previously, it's not because I was lazy, it's not because I was cheating, it's because I was, I found my own way to support myself. So that's interesting. And then we can kind of lean into those things in our teaching and in the way that we interact with our students, and the way we set up our business, and the way we put in standard operating procedures, and who we hire to help us with our business, and how we work through working with people. So that's the third reason I think it's really important for us to talk about neurodiversity in the voice studio, is that it's not just our students that we're talking about here. We are also talking about lots of folks who are not diagnosed, or who maybe never thought about things before. And so what does that understanding of neurodiversity and how brains work, how does that change the way I perceive myself? How does that change the way that I work in the studio? How does that change my procedures, the way I teach? How does that give or shed a light on the way that I work in the studio? So, and in some ways, the population of voice teachers is maybe a little bit weighted toward, oh, thanks, David. Very excellent to hear about inclusivity and voice right together. Yeah, thank you, David. In some ways, the population of voice teachers is a little bit weighted toward undiagnosed folks, because there's I don't have actual stats, but there are more women teaching in independent voice studios than there are men, and there are lots and lots and lots of LGTBQ folks, and lots of gender non-conforming folks in the arts, of course, but also and now also teaching. So this kind of, I think, again, I have no stats, so I'll just completely my experience and completely anecdotal, but it seems to me that our field may actually be like a haven for folks who folks who are perhaps undiagnosed, or folks who are neurodivergent, and I think that's something, I think that's something to be celebrated. It's wonderful, but I think that's why we need to talk about it, especially in this population. We've got lots of folks, lots of women, lots of LGBTQ folks. Doesn't necessarily mean that we're all neurodivergent, of course. At all, but it certainly does mean that there may be a higher probability of voice teachers being neurodivergent versus in other fields. I mean, it's possible, So, Allison says, it's wonderful to hear this conversation. It gives so much validation, something I've always felt. Each individual support shares a piece of themselves with me, and it's our responsibility, to honor that. And just be a listening ear through that process, using music to explore and celebrate their gifts. Yeah, and that, I think that's the other thing, is that, or you bring up another point, a good point, Allison, I think, is that we, by the very nature of what we do, which is we teach music, and we teach people how to use their voices, right? And how to communicate in the way that they want to communicate. I mean, that the very nature of what we do is to give voice and amplify voices. That's literally what we do. Is we help people amplify their own voices, right? And sometimes literally with amplification, but like we help people to find and amplify and affirm their voices. So what that means is that when we look through this neurodiversity lens and through inclusivity in the voice studio, we are then also giving people the tool, literally in our lessons, we're giving them the tool to amplify, include, have a larger say in the world. This is, I mean, it's incredible. It goes really, really well with voice lessons, right? So understanding inclusivity and understanding neurodiversity, and like I said, I mean, my kind of shtick is understanding through a neurodivergent lens. But yeah, so all of those things, those are the reasons. So I added one reason just at the end there, but again, the first reason, I've got like this like personal connection. I want to make the world a better place for my own kids. So there you go. I want other kids to grow up and, find places that they feel absolutely supported and included in. And affirmed in, right? So that's what I want. That's one. And then the second one is that we support all of our students by understanding inclusivity and understanding neurodivergence. Understanding inclusivity through a neurodivergent lens. And third, we support ourselves. We find validation and we find ways to support ourselves and to understand ourselves better. And then the fourth one, which Allison kind of brought up there as well, is just that by doing this work through an inclusivity lens, we are also literally amplifying voices. Literally teaching people how to use their voice. And this is having a neurodivergent child 11 years ago changed the way I teach. In turn, I have many students who have found me. Yeah, I feel that too. And it's like, I feel like, the way that, I mean, some of you know my story, but the way that working with my own kids therapists and understanding how, understanding those things helped me to be the kind of teacher that other neurodivergent folks were attracted to. I'm just realizing that I maybe need to go answer the door. It looks like somebody's here to do some stuff, but that's okay. I'm on my way out anyway, so I will leave it there. Have a terrific weekend. This is like the shortest live office hours I think I've ever done. Take care.